Hi, I'm Craig Umbaugh. I'm an attorney now with Hogan Lovells, based in Denver, Colorado. I have been working on the baseball stadium district since its inception, representing the stadium district as its legal counsel. I first got involved in the project right after the legislation passed and the district was created. I was at another firm, Fairfield and Woods at the time, and John McHale was the new chairman of the baseball stadium district, and he asked my law partner at the time, Jack Sperling, to if we would volunteer our services, because there were no funds to pay for legal services at the time. They would do that if we would take on a contingency the legal work for the baseball district. So we agreed to do that, and fortunately the elections all passed and everything came to be, and I've gone on to make a career out of representing the baseball district as well as the football district and numerous other cities, stadium districts, teams across the country. So, some of my earliest recollections were trying to get the district up and running. The legislation had passed and it created the district. Representative Williams had passed that legislation, and we had a 7-member board and kind of a mandate to try to get a baseball stadium, because Major League Baseball had said they wanted a city that was willing to build a baseball-only stadium. And that was one of the things. Obviously, we had Mile High Stadium at the time, the old Broncos football stadium, but that was a much bigger stadium, and the whole trend in baseball had been to smaller stadiums. There were kind of two tasks we had at hand after the legislation passed. The first one was we had to get an election on the ballot, and that was to pass the 1/10 of a cent sales tax increase. And I think we have been fortunate in Colorado that we kind of had an infrastructure, at least that people were familiar with, and the sponsors of the baseball district legislation, in my opinion, were smart enough to kind of piggyback on that. But the RTD district had been created that kind of brought the 6-county, now 7-county area together at the time, and then the scientific and cultural facility district had passed and put that 1/10 of a cent tax in place. So I think people were, at that point used to cooperating. There was kind of this cooperative structure at least in place. As I've talked to a lot of other cities, they've wanted to know how you can get that in place. And I think we were lucky to piggyback on something that had already been created. One of my earlier memories is we had to get the question on the ballot for I think it was an August 1990 election, and we had to get it on the ballot in each county. And at the time, one of my tasks were I had to go to each county, meet with the county clerk and recorders about getting the question certified for their ballot to hold it at a special election. And then we had to pay the costs of holding the special election, because otherwise there were no other elections on. So the Chamber of Commerce and others had to come up with the funds to put the question on the ballot. And I drove to each of the county commissions to meet with the clerk and county recorder to get that question on the ballot. So that was the first step, getting the question on the ballot, and we had the election in 1990 and had the campaign for that. I was a little bit on the sidelines for the campaign, obviously hoping it passed and hoping baseball would come to Colorado. But as the district was responsible for the election, we were precluded from spending any money or working on the campaign. So you had the Colorado Baseball Coalition and that group come on board to actually run it and do the campaign. And my recollection is it was faltering a little bit at the beginning. And then Joe Blake and Gary Antonoff, who I give a lot of credit, came on board and actually were able to raise some money to get that campaign going, and then brought Rick Ryder in to get a campaign really up and running. And then we had a successful election, but that was only part of the way. Then we needed a baseball team. So the next focus was on getting a team. My recollection is there were 6 cities in the running. Indianapolis, Buffalo, Washington, D.C., Charlotte, Miami, and Denver were kind of the 6 finalists to try to get a baseball team. And it was kind of a lot of jockeying between cities. We came up with the concept of I didn't, but the baseball coalition and the supporters behind it came up with the concept of the time zone without a team. And, recognizing between Kansas City and San Francisco, there were no Major League Baseball teams at the time. So we had the whole effort to get the team there. I remember the National League and the Major League Baseball coming through town and we had a big rally down at, it's now Wells Fargo, but the United Bank building in the atrium. And that was the day I really thought this was probably going to happen, because it was truly kind of a grassroots outpouring. It's still really vivid in my mind from campaigns. There were just so many moms and dads with their kids, kids with baseball gloves, kids in Little League uniforms. I mean, you can try to orchestrate a little bit of that in a campaign, in a political campaign, but you can't just cause that place to be packed like it was and so many people cheering. I really think that day made a huge impact on the National League and Major League Baseball in terms of bringing in a team. So, and then I vividly remember, I think it was July, right around the 4th of July, 1991, we get the announcement that Denver and Miami were going to get the teams. And so that was exciting. But then the real work kind of for the stadium district started. 2 years in Mile High Stadium while we were going to build Coors Field. I think we all remember well the first game at Mile High Stadium, the 80,000 people. I don't think anybody worked that day in Denver, honestly. I think in terms of economic productivity, that's probably a low point in Denver, because I don't recall anybody working. It was a total festival in the city. And we've had Super Bowls and Stanley Cups and other things since, but I still don't think there was kind of that sense of community outpouring the way there was in that day. And then, a storybook day for the first game when Eric Young hits home run. That's what I will always remember. One of the other things was my wife, who we had just been newly married, didn't really think, I don't think had been much of a baseball fan, and she really wanted to go to the game. And I said, so if you're going to go, you've got to learn at least the starting lineup, because there's a lot of people that want these tickets. So I made her learn the starting lineup. And,
it was the day you got her hooked.
It was the day we got her hooked. And so we've been Rockies fans ever since that day. So, the next part was building a stadium. Once we had a team, we had to build a stadium. And, some of my memories of that there were really 3 sites kind of that was narrowed down to Coors Field, where the stadium is today. Where the Pepsi Center was one of the other sites, and then kind of a golden triangle site were the 3 sites I think that people were really focused in on. There seemed to be a lot of desire from the city at the time and a lot of people in the Denver City Council to put it where the Pepsi Center is today, in that location. Remember, part of the legislation was to bring in the Urban Land Institute to do a study and kind of depoliticize the site selection a little bit. And I think that was one of the other really key great moves. Brought in ULI, they spent an entire weekend doing an evaluation of all the sites. And each site had merits, each site had issues, but what they really concluded was that the Coors Field site, really did a lot to activate your downtown. It could let people walk, you could utilize existing parking, and I think over the years that's proven to be a brilliant decision. I mean, when I've seen stadiums across the country and worked on stadium projects across the country, baseball's 81 games a year at least, and hopefully more if you're in the playoffs, the World Series, and the ability of people to walk to games, to spend time after games, and to weave that into your kind of urban context has been really important and something I've always believed in, since I've seen the success of Coors Field. I think you see sometimes economic studies that say baseball really doesn't, sports don't stimulate anything. I really think it has to be a case-by-case study. If you put a stadium out by itself, it's going to have 10 days of economic development. I think Coors Field transformed lower downtown, in my opinion. I also think the site was great. There was kind of a natural bowl there that really let that stadium, if you've looked at other stadiums around the country, it kind of let that stadium be to scale for the surrounding areas. So, we take it for granted that you walk in kind of at mid-level and you can go up or down to get to your seats, which allowed the stadium to be half as high as another stadium. If you go out to San Francisco and look at their stadium, you walk in on ground level and everything's up to get there. And that stadium appears much bigger and more towering. It doesn't quite fit in the neighborhood the way Coors Field does. So, that was a big part of it. We had the 10th of a cent sales tax. We had to get bond financing done. Worked with Mike Sharotis and Dave Scott, who at the time were over at Davis, Graham and Stubbs, to put together the bond financing and get that done. And then, get all the deals done. Brought in what was then HOK, now Populous Architects, to do the design. One of my recollections is the original design was kind of a sandstone. It kind of looked at like a Folsom Field and that kind of look. And then, fortunately, kind of through the process and the design process, it evolved into the red brick that really, I think, fits that area and that structure so well over there. I mean, I think it's, it's part of the urban fabric, if you will, really fits the neighborhood, and really, the architects really picked up on what we needed to do. And so, getting deals done with the architects, getting deals done with Mortensen and Barton Mallow, had just done Camden Yards in Baltimore, which I think we got lucky a little bit in the design curve of stadiums. I remember getting to go look at stadiums. Comiskey Park had come up in Chicago, and to me, that was kind of the old style stadium, kind of the big bowl, sort of just, they all looked the same, kind of round bowl stadium. And Camden Yards had been the first throwback stadium, and I think that really kicked off a kind of trend with the architects to those stadiums. Cleveland and Arlington came along right after that, and our stadium all in design at the same time, and picked up on that concept. I know one thing we did take from Comiskey Park is when we toured it, we liked the fact that you could walk all the way around the stadium and look in the whole way around. And that hadn't been how other stadiums had been designed. You'd kind of put the walls there and other things. And we liked the idea that you could see into the stadium. And again, I think that's one of the great factors of Coors Field. It gives it that kind of feeling. The stadium was originally going to be 43,000 seats. And then suddenly the Rockies were averaging, I think, about 65,000 a game, and we had the 80,000 at the first game, and just game after game. So the Rockies approached the district about expanding around the outfield curve and adding another 7,000 seats, which they ended up paying for out there. In some respects, I think that really helped also, to me, make the stadium, because you have it kind of filled in all the way around. So now when you walk around the outfield, you can walk back behind there, and it's filled in the whole way, and that was a challenge, because we already had plans and were already going when the decision was made to add some seats. So that was exciting. And then there are obviously the legal challenges that popped up the way, or not necessarily legal challenges, but of course the call came in that I think it was a Friday afternoon. They'd found dinosaur bones at the stadium. We were all like, "Oh no!" I don't think any course in law school teaches you what to do with that. So we stopped construction for a few days while they excavated that. That was an interesting day, and the dinosaur, of course, that led to Dinger being the mascot. That's kind of why we have Dinger. I think that's lost on a lot of people today, why the Colorado Rockies have a dinosaur mascot, but remember that from those days. So, it's been an exciting adventure, and I've stayed representing the district the whole time. Really excited. We just negotiated a 30-year lease extension with the Rockies, and no taxpayer funds on that. The Rockies are going to have the opportunity to develop the west parking lot, which, has a lot of development opportunities. And if you remember, Coors Field seemed to be way out. It was in a rail yard. It was in the middle of nowhere. So to have all this development around Coors Field and these development opportunities, I really think proves out the success story for Coors Field. And the quality of the construction of that stadium, the Rockies' upkeep of that stadium, the district's oversight of the stadium. Interesting fact, Texas Rangers Arlington Stadium came online the year before Coors Field. The Atlanta Braves Stadium came online the year after Coors Field. Both of those stadiums are being torn down and replaced with new stadiums. Mm-hmm. So, two similar stadiums, and we just signed 30 more years with the Rockies. So that stadium's going to be there at least 50 plus years, and hopefully more. So, but.
Well, I know, Craig, you have some familiarity with the legislative process, and specifically the Colorado legislature. And I think you're very aware that if in fact a bill costs money, that its chances of getting through the legislature are probably slim and none. And so I know that you mentioned that there were no funds given to the stadium district to operate with. What other kinds of challenges did that present to you and the stadium authority trying to get things put together so people would have an idea of exactly what they were voting for?
So you had all kinds of challenges along that line. I mean, you needed legal counsel to negotiate all these agreements. You needed bond counsel to look at what a financing structure would be. I think investment bankers are a little more used to working with the idea that they'll get paid when the financing happens. We had architects. You needed architects. People wanted to see what this was going to look like. People wanted to know what it was going to cost. You needed construction companies. Barton Mallow and Mortensen teamed up to do that. You had a board of people. I mean, prominent people in the community. It was, Edmundo Gonzalez, Deborah Brody over the years, a whole lot of people, Ray Baker and John McHale, of course. Max Wiley, who was running a bank in his spare time. I mean, you kind of wondered where these people found all the time to do this. And the other thing that was going on was the community was trying to put together a baseball team because we didn't have a team. There,
Didn't have an owner, right.
Needed an ownership group. I was not as involved in the ownership group discussions. It was Paul Jacobs trying to help pull together an ownership group, and kind of John McHale for the baseball stadium district, and the governor. But I think everybody had assumed it was going to be a $50 million expansion fee. And when the Major League Baseball came out with a $90 million expansion fee, to use the pun, it was a curveball completely for everybody. And suddenly all the financial metrics that had been done, had to change. Fortunately, again, the Denver community rallied, and you were able to get the Coors family to step up and some other prominent people to invest in having the funds to even pay the expansion fee to get a team. So, it was a big challenge. It was a lot of people betting a lot of time and energy on the community. Whether it was lawyers, construction companies, architects. I mean, it was all, if this happens, there'll be money to pay you. If it doesn't, there isn't. And I know the legislature has liked to kind of throw that challenge out there on a number of projects. And, I think the good news is some of them have been successful, so people can see there is a chance you're going to get paid on those. But,
right. Well, and along with that, I know that you guys had to take donated space, and at the same time, the public is wanting a lot of detailed information so they know what they're voting on.
Yeah.
And I know part of the challenge that Neil and I had, even in putting the legislation together, was we certainly didn't know how much it was going to cost to build a stadium. We didn't know how much a team was going to cost. We were in a recession at the time. We didn't know how long it would take to pay back the price
right.
for a stadium we didn't know. So,
and if you remember, I recall, so 89 the initial legislation passes. In 90 we came back with a couple tweaks to the legislation, including taking the bond term from 15 to 20 years because it gave us more bonding capacity as we spent the year digging into what a stadium's going to cost. Ironically, I mean, it was one of the great things. I mean, I think Colorado, instead of kind of bunkering down during a recession, decided we're going to look at an airport, we're going to bring Major League Baseball. We kind of doubled down on our bets with, Federico Pena as the mayor and, the state legislature. Instead of saying, let's just hunker down and cut everything, we decided we were going to go the opposite way and almost, kind of envision our way out of this economic downturn. But we did come back with some tweaks in 1990 with the legislation to take the term out to 20 years. The irony being, after this downturn, the economy then exploded. Right. We ended up paying those bonds off in 10 years. The bonds we issued, we had a 20-year term, we paid them off in half the time. And because the economy had grown so much and had been so successful, the football stadium district and the Denver Broncos were able to use that back end of 10 years to finance the new football stadium, the Sports Authority Field now. So, their campaign was you were getting 2 stadiums for the price of 1, but it was really kind of that envisioning at the beginning that let that happen too. So, I mean, it really created a domino effect to create a couple stadiums that have, I think, served the community well. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine Denver and Colorado without the Rockies, without the Broncos, without all the success we've had. And ironically, the Pepsi Center ended up going where that other site was, and now we kind of have this jewel of stadiums across lower downtown. You have Coors Field over to the Pepsi Center, over to the football stadium.
With mass transit in between.
Now we've put a light rail line and Union Station in there, and I don't think we quite knew how visionary we were at the time when we picked that rail yard. Yeah. One of the other issues I remember in sitting in a number of meetings were, proponents of what's now the Pepsi Center site wanting the district to buy that site. And our real issue wasn't necessarily like we wanted one side or the other. We could afford the site where Coors Field is today, which was much cheaper. I remember people saying, well, get your own appraisal over here. And we're like, we're not disputing the appraisal. We're just telling you we don't have that much money, And that was Union Pacific's rail yards over there, and they were looking to abandon it. So, the prices were pretty cheap over there. And in fact, some of the parking lots were almost a throw-in by the railroad at really cheap prices, which now when you look at kind of the parking need downtown and imagine Coors Field being constrained with no parking, it would be I think, a problem for the team to operate. Light rail solves some of the problems today, and people are obviously much more mass transit. But the Rockies have continued to be, a regional draw. I think every time I meet with them and we talk about parking needs, they point out that, well, folks from Wyoming, Nebraska, eastern Kansas, New Mexico, Utah that are coming to our games aren't taking light rail to get to our game. If you walk through a Rockies parking lot, you can pick out a lot of regional license plates, and I think it's been a great draw.
So how much time do you think you speculated and your law firm speculated before you actually started to get some money?
Oh,
How many hours?
Thousands.
Thousands?
Yeah,
Wow.
I bet between Jack and I and Mike McKinstry, who had been doing some of the real estate work, and other people in our firm, that we had thousands of hours over a few years into it. So because
That's a big bet on the company.
it was a big bet. I kind of wonder where my career and Jack's and other people's would be today if that hadn't happened. But getting the election passed was the first hurdle. But the election was contingent on getting awarded a Major League Baseball team. So it was sort of, you had 10 minutes to celebrate that we had passed the election and the voters had decided to impose this 1/10 of a cent sales tax. And then it was another year's worth of work.
Just brought you to another challenge,
Just to keep going, and still without the funding. And, I always think it was a great thing that, Gary Antonoff and Joe Blake, they do stand out in my mind, kind of stepping up to rally the business community and,
Because it was hard getting money at that point in time since we were in a recession.
It was in a recession. It's also, another political campaign, and do we really have to do this for a campaign? And then it was hard. In some ways, I think it was hard. In some ways, I think maybe it was better. You didn't have a specific team. I was in some cities building. You always get caught up in other cities I've worked in, the dynamic of the owner. Who's the owner? Do you like him? Do you not like him? How's the team doing? If you look at the football stadium elections, fortuitously for the Broncos, they had won a Super Bowl or were on their way to winning a Super Bowl. They had won, and the goodwill towards them was great. If you're not, we were able to really just focus on baseball and having the product of having Major League Baseball in Colorado, in Denver. Did we want this to be something that was part of our city? And I think Denver would be a great city without Major League Baseball. I think it completely changed the complexion and dynamics of lower downtown. I think it's a great amenity to have. I've always believed, you can define the community to be what you want it to be, but I think sports plays a really important role in bringing this community together. I think the arts do. In various times I've been on boards or asked to speak on things that have tried to pit the arts versus sports and things. And I think that's a completely wrong question, honestly. I think it shouldn't be or, it's an and. I think you need both. I think it's important to have the DCPA as much as it is to have the Colorado Rockies, but I don't think the question is which one do you want. I think it's, if you really want to be the city, I think you want both of those. So.
Well, I know you mentioned some tweaks to the legislation, that we had to come back and tweak the legislation, and one of the reasons the legislation needed to be tweaked is that Major League Baseball pushed up their schedule on when they were going to make their decision, and we had kind of counted on a general election being in November, and
right.
When they were going to make a decision sooner, we had to put it on the primary ballot. So
that's I'd forgotten that. You're right.
And the other piece then was the Senate sponsor, being in real estate, felt that eminent domain was a violation of private property rights. And I know you all went along with no eminent domain, but ultimately ran into a problem. Do you want to talk about that problem?
Sure. So you're right. The original legislation passed in '89, amended in '90, set out the powers that the district as a governmental entity, as a board, had. But one of the things it did not have was the power of eminent domain, and that, as you mentioned, had been a clear decision of the legislature that we weren't going to give them this power. And I think there was concern that you had a 7-person board appointed by the governor, and how would they use it, could they abuse it, etc. We picked the location, and as I said, ULI had been recommending that as the site. We had the location. It was really the most affordable. Most of the property was the railroad property. That was 95% of the property. But along Blake Street, there were some properties owned by individual property owners. And the baseball district was able to work out a deal with almost all of those to acquire the property. But the home plate was owned by a longtime Colorado family who had some old, my recollection is, abandoned warehouses there. And we just weren't able to come to an agreement with them and a price with them. And any price that they wanted or conditions they wanted were just outside of our range or ability to pay. And without eminent domain, it was kind of no way to force them to come to the plate for, the public purpose of building a baseball stadium. So we ended up having to go back to the legislature, I think it was in '93, and run a bill that was like a paragraph long. Just added one section, and it gave the district eminent domain power for a limited amount of time. So, it's still probably one of the most interesting paragraphs you'll find in a statute. It gave eminent domain power for 3 years or 2 years or something. And it prescribed where we could go to. It's like the center line of Blake Street, the center line of 20th Street. So, they were clear they didn't want us condemning our way across downtown. I'm not sure for what we would have done. The baseball district would have done that. But, that was a tough fight. And it put, I think even today it's a constant tension in the legislature with private property rights versus the ability to hold up a project that kind of the public and the community wants, and whether it's a road or stadium or other public amenities. So once that passed and the district had, what it did was it really gave the district leverage. It caused the parties to have to come to the table. Senator Schroeder had been our Senate sponsor on that, and brought it to the table. Norma Anderson was really helpful. Mike Feely had been really helpful to us on getting that bill through the legislature, although it was a tough fight in the legislature. The district had lobbyists that had been working with us in the Rockies, and other parties retained lobbyists, and there were some people that just on principle didn't want to go there. But once we got that power, then we were able to reach a deal. Once it became clear, then you're just fighting about price, and once you're just fighting about price versus selling, you could get a deal done. I do recall that unlike, I think, the construction people will tell you, any stadium in the world, you usually start at home plate and build around. We were on a tight construction schedule, so we're working to get this bill passed in the legislature and hopefully be able to acquire home plate. Started building out in center field. So they started building center field back to home plate to at least stay on the construction schedule. Kind of an interesting recalculation from Mortensen and those guys on how to build a building to keep it going.
And there was less density out there than there was by home plate, obviously.
Oh yeah, but you want to, you're going to build this way or this way. You're going to build home plate out, or you're going to build center field in, which is not the way I think you typically build it, because, as you're saying, I mean, your offices, your press box, and everything's behind home plate versus the rock pile and everything. But we had a construction schedule. I mean, we needed to be open for the beginning of '95, which. We got there, and 2 years at Mile High Stadium, and then the move to Coors Field, which was tempered a little bit. If you recall, we had the strike, the player strike that happened at the end of '94, and kind of shortened that season. So, I think opening day was supposed to be like April 8th or something like that. It didn't happen until like April 26th. We had the delay. But that was exciting. Everybody, I mean, it's turned out to be an incredible venue, and the excitement of that, one of the things I remember is everybody that worked for the district, including the whole board and everybody, was out there wiping down the seats. The stadium, we weren't sure when the stadium was going to get used. They had played the last spring training preseason games. Had kind of given a test drive to Coors Field, I believe, with games against the Yankees. Game or two against the Yankees, right? But then the strike was on, and so there was no regular season. So right before that, we had everybody, Ray Baker at the time, everybody were out there wiping down seats all night. Just everybody had to pitch in to get that done. So
well, we've talked a little bit about political realities, and one of the political realities, at least that I heard from some of the outlying counties, is this just going to be an issue where we're building a stadium that's just going to help Denver and not help anybody else? And so we put revenue sharing into the bill, and we also indicated that other locations other than Denver could submit sites. Are you aware of some of the other counties submitting sites, or how that process went?
So it's bringing back a lot of. So we went through. I don't think originally there were any submissions from the other counties. We had a number from Denver and various different sites in Denver. After kind of the selection of the site had come out, we received a site from Douglas County, not from a developer a landowner in Douglas County. Brought it to the board. They actually filed a lawsuit to try to enjoin the selection of the site, and said we had failed to consider their site, which I don't think anybody on the board had really been familiar with. And we went through the pleadings and we're looking on how to respond. And I remember Dan Muse, for one, who was on the board, went on to be city attorney of Denver. Dan said, let's make sure that site is in the baseball stadium district boundaries, because if you recall, the boundaries are the RTD boundaries, so they don't necessarily take in all of every county.
Especially Douglas County. Yeah.
Douglas County, some of them. So we looked, and the site was not within the boundaries of the stadium district. Wow. So it was ineligible to be considered for a site. So we quickly got that dismissed and moved away from. I think assembling kind of the land and the infrastructure made it unlikely that the site could be other places. But it was possible, and we did look. We had meetings in every county. And if you remember, interestingly, to your point, the election actually did not pass in Denver.
No, it passed in Denver. It didn't pass in Adams County.
In Boulder, maybe, right?
Adams County, it didn't pass.
Adams County, it didn't pass. And then there subsequently was a lawsuit that they felt they didn't need to pay the tax because the county didn't pass the issue.
And
so it passed with 54%, so it wasn't.
Yeah, it wasn't. But I think Arapahoe County really, kind of carried the day. If my recollection of that election was right, I think big turnout there, and obviously I think Denver benefited from it. I think it helped transform the downtown of Denver. I think what it did for the region, though, was, my take. I think it got a lot of people from the outlying suburbs to come downtown, to figure out that it was pretty easy to come downtown, that there were a lot of things to see and do down there, that it wasn't that hard. And I really think it really kind of brought the whole metro area together more, that You know, you could come into Denver. It was a great area. It was a fun place to bring your family. And I have to believe that it's helped the museums over the years and everything else.
Even
All
the
the
convention center business.
convention center, all the cultural amenities kind of in Denver, which I think serve the whole region, have been really benefited from kind of the dynamics that Coors Field created.
Were there any other legal challenges that you had in the beginning?
You know, I think we were in pretty good shape. I mean, you know, Kathy alluded to, we had I don't know if it ever got to litigation, but the concern that all the counties had to vote for it. And that had been kind of decided by the courts in the previous iteration of trying to do the RTA legislation, that you didn't have to have everybody in a district vote for it. It wasn't like a county by county thing.
Right.
You know, we had the home plate challenges, you know, but mostly the legal challenges were more just a lot of contracts and keeping things on pace and getting a lease deal done with the Rockies, which had to be put in place too. You know, I think it's turned out, as I said, we just got it redone, but I think it turned out to be a great deal. It kind of had, the district kind of turned the model a little bit on its head at the time for how you looked at stadiums, and I think we had a number of real estate people kind of on the board, a Deb Brody, a Ray Baker, who said, let's put the costs of maintaining and running the stadium on the private entity instead of the public entity. And the legislation directed the board to try to find ways to privatize operations and the costs of the stadium. And so, as opposed to a lot of cities at the time, a Chicago or whatever, where the team paid what seemed like a big number in rent, $3-4 million, but then the public was responsible for all the upkeep and all the operations and paying the ushers, et cetera. Put it all on the team, so it kind of took it out of the public trying to manage ushers and grounds crews and having people on a public payroll. You know, I think at one time we looked and the Maryland Stadium Authority had like 80 employees, and the baseball district, you know, had 12, I think, maybe at your height. You know, you could ask a John Lehigh or a Tom Gleason. I think, you know, at 12 maybe was the maximum that it had, and used outside consultants. But, you know, really charged the Rockies with keeping up that stadium, which they've done fabulously. But it was a big cost to them, and it kind of incented the party who benefits the most from having a clean stadium. That was the other thing.
Right.
I mean, we want our ushers to be really responsible. We want our grounds crew to be really good. So.
Well, one of the disputes that Neil and I had was with the governor, and it was over the appointments to the stadium authority. I know the governor felt that, you know, this is a weak governor state, and one of the appointments, or one of the powers that the governor has is the appointment power. And of course, I think the concern that Neil and I had is that sometimes appointments get to be political payback, and that you don't always get the best qualified people. And so in the legislation, we did indicate there had to be people who had background in public finance or construction or contract negotiation. Do you think that ended up serving you all well?
Oh, I think it served really well. So first of all, you know, to your point about there weren't really funds to get all this done, so there was a lot, you know, a lot of people, and not just people on the board. You know, there were the legislators, there were people like Neil, there were consultants, there were lots of people in the community, the baseball commission folks, all jumping in this effort. It wasn't a board to be on to show up, you know, once a quarter or once a month and get your name in the paper. It was a roll up your sleeve, get things done, lots of meetings, boards, and, you know, good background in real estate, finance. As you said, you had bankers like Max Wiley, you had guys who had done a lot in real estate like Ray or Deborah Brody, who's had been in the real estate business. You had corporate executives like an Edmundo Gonzalez. I mean, you had a lot of different people bringing a lot. Penn Tate from Boulder, who had been the mayor up in Boulder, you know, brought an outline kind of different view and a really push for diversity in contracting and things like that to the board. So you had a lot of people, you know, like that on the board. And I think the governor, you know, I obviously wasn't privy to any of your discussions with the governor, but I think the governor really, you know, consciously, at least Governor Romer, looked to have different counties represented. I mean, it certainly wasn't a board of Denver people. It certainly wasn't a board of just former elected officials or currently elected officials. It really brought that whole kind of range of, the committed public citizen to the board. And I think it's how Colorado's done a lot of things. I think we're a really fortunate state that we have a lot of talented people that are willing to spend a lot of time sitting on boards, public boards, and rolling up their sleeves.
So you put this all together, and then you're pretty far down the track, and then all of a sudden, you learn that one of the primary people in the ownership group is being indicted. How did the board react to that?
Yeah, I was much less involved in I was much more focused on Coors Field. That kind of broke out to focus me on Coors Field. Obviously, that was a huge curveball. Would love to sit down and talk to Paul Jacobs about some of the machinations that were going on. I think the district, in part, I'm sure that Ray Baker's the chair, and some of them were, acutely aware and concerned of those issues. Kind of my task was, almost became, you've got to keep going on the stadium. The stadium has a financing mechanism. There's a 1/10 of a cent. It's in place. We've been awarded a team. Focus on that stadium. The stadium district, keep building the stadium. Somebody will figure this out. There's going to be a team there. And, fortunately, Jerry McMorris and Montfort's and others stepped up at the time to keep the team and keep an ownership group here.
Right.
So what inspired you to take this no-pay gamble, you and your firm?
Well, I've told people at the time, I think I was lucky that I wasn't the senior partner at the time. So for me as a younger attorney, it was an incredible opportunity. I'd been interested in politics, had been working, one of my clients had been the Colorado Bankers Association, so I've been doing work up at the legislature for them and others. So obviously, I've been a huge sports fan. I'd grown up a Cincinnati Reds fan. I'd gone to school in Chicago and skipped a few classes to spend time in the bleachers in Wrigley Fields. And, it's one of the things I'd really missed about Colorado was baseball and not having Major League Baseball. We obviously had the Bears, and they were exciting. And the Zephyrs, I guess they became. And, that was a great product, but it wasn't Major League Baseball. So I think the firm, at the time saw it as an opportunity. Hopefully this would pass. I think we really believed in a lot of the people that were involved. And, I think people in Colorado, and I was fortunate to be at a firm at the time that was willing to take a risk to try to help get something done. And at the end of the day, it would have been a great pro bono project if it hadn't happened. Maybe not a great pro bono project, but, I was happy that Jack Sperling got to be the one to convince the partners instead of me that we should do this. But, for a relatively new attorney, and I think one reason I got chosen to get involved is I realized it wasn't just about sports. This was much more about sports. It was about politics, but it was about urban development. It was about economic development. It was about how do you want to brand your community. I mean, I love baseball, and I'm a huge baseball fan, but building a stadium like this, deciding you're going to build a baseball stadium like this, having the community come together, have all the pieces that have to happen, it's about a lot more than baseball. I mean, that's what it had to be, and that's kind of the success it's been. I think if you look at what Coors Field's done for Lower Downtown, it's done for Denver, certainly Denver's a lot different now than it was 25 years ago, and I certainly think a much more world-class city.
Right.
Very well said. Great job.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Really.